All right. Please take a look at our equity statement here on your screen. This is the center of our work. And it's really important that we share the structure of 21 CSLA as well, because the structure of 21 CSLA really does impact our work in PLLS. In the work of 21 CSLA, we have 7 regional academies. You see the map here of the 7 regional academies spread across the state. And the regional academies are the ones doing the actual work of serving the individual leaders. So when the work of PLLS focus on supporting the regional academies, we're talking about these folks here working across the state. And then, of course, we at the State Center, housed in UC Berkeley, are supporting the work of the 7 regional academies, including through the work here of PLLS. The work of PLLS is guided by the 3 underlying 21 CSLA principles. They are continuous improvement, equity leadership, and professional learning. A couple of the goals we have for the PLLS project is to, like we said, support the regional academies, their leaders who are responsible for implementing professional learning across the state. And of course, as Nancy mentioned, to develop a model for PLLS. The language here you see is really our work about how we aim to support the regional leaders. And the important thing here is to really stay equity centered as we support folks in their self-study. As Nancy mentioned, we are building off of the traditional application of lesson study, and we're pushing the work into professional learning for leaders. We're going to ask you to take a minute now, or a few minutes now, just to reflect on your own work. So feel free to unmute to share out your thought, or please put your thoughts into the chat. In your current work, what opportunities do you have for self-study or for data-driven reflection on your own practice so that it impacts the work that you do? However you define that. What are your current opportunities for data-driven reflection? If you're so moved, feel free to unmute and jump right in.
I think I'll go ahead and jump in if you don't.
Please, thank you.
I think one of the things that's critical to me in the work I do, whether it's schools, districts, or across the state, is to gather that data, first of all, to intentionally gather that data, even if it's an exit ticket, and then to really carve out time to look at that data if I'm doing it in collaboration, then even to use a protocol that guides us to the very important part of data analysis, which is now what? We've looked at it. How do we now adjust, adapt, reflect, and continue to improve and grow based on what that data is saying to us? So that's practice I have.
Thank you so much for getting us started. Really appreciate you for jumping right in. Other thoughts?
Hello, my name is Sean Dean. I work with Gateway Community Charters. I'm working on an AI tool that automates the collection of data for PLC coordinators. So we're really in the midst of doing journey mapping, figuring out who is the right person to get the data, who needs to authorize it. So learning how everyone reflects on this is really helpful for us as well.
Thank you so much. I see a couple comments there in the chat. Feel free to peruse those and add your own. I see there are different ways that people collect and define data, really, even, right? It could be surveys, it could be through meetings that we hold with people, those are instances as well to provide us with data on the work that we're doing. I like that people are giving thumbs up to the comments in the chat. Thank you for those who have already shared out and for those who are in your own personal reflection around this. This is important because this is really central to the work that we're trying to do with PLLS as we will present to you today. So I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Melissa.
All right, thanks, Viet. So we're going to talk a little bit about what professional learning lesson study is today, and with that connector question around what opportunities exist for data-driven reflection on your own practice. So the practice that we'll be talking about with data-driven reflection is the practice of providing professional learning. And so we do this in 21 CSLA through consultancy and feedback in a community of practice, using consultancy protocols and structured feedback so that we're continuously engaging in equity-centered self-study. And so as we go through our process today of sharing out with you our emergent professional learning lesson study model, we're going to go ahead and engage in a protocol that we use collaboratively in our community of practice. And so our sample protocol is adapted from the Center for Leadership and Education Equity. So we're going to be doing a chalk talk together today as we go through talking about professional learning lesson study. All right, and so this is the protocol that we've used. We've used it in our community of practice and we'll be using it today. And so I'll be telling you about the professional learning lesson study model. And as a whole group, please feel free to add to the Chalk Talk via the Padlet. The link is in the chat with words or graphics. You can do this as I'm sharing out, but as we learned doing this in our community of practice, participants also appreciate some time after the content to add to the Chalk Talk. It could be words, graphics, questions, comments, any general reflections, and feel free to comment on each other's ideas, and we may also comment on, answer, or ask questions as we go, and then we'll take some time to look at what is on the Padlet and have a discussion, and then we, as the presenters, will, echo back some reflections on what we've seen and heard. And so as you hear about professional learning lesson study, there are two focal questions that we would like to pose. One is, what are your key takeaways as a practitioner or researcher? And what is still unclear, or what questions emerge as we go through this content? So all of what we do throughout lesson study is a parallel process, because we, as the 21 CSLA State Center, are in the process of developing a model in collaboration with the regional academies. And so feedback is really important for us as well as we do this. And so your feedback today and what's reflected on the Padlet will also help us in considering some of these questions. What are the key takeaways from the content that we're sharing? And what questions are coming up for folks who may not be as familiar with professional learning lesson study? And so the key concepts that guide lesson study are continuous improvement, improvement science, and into lesson study. And so there are numerous methods of continuous improvement, ranging from cycles of inquiry to design-based research to the plan, do, study, act approach. And four common characteristics of these are grounding improvement efforts in local problems or needs, which is really essential to the professional learning lesson study process, because as you saw in that map, we are engaging with a variety of different contexts, which all have different professional learning needs and strengths that emerge. And so with that, we also want to empower practitioners to take an active role in the research and improvement. And so we do this in partnership as a research practice partnership, and then engaging in a process of action, assessment, reflection, and continuously adjusting. And what we're really doing is in an effort to spur change across schools and systems, not just in individual classrooms. So we really want the focus on equity to go across these four characteristics as we go through lesson study as a method of continuous improvement, as an approach. And so leading for equity in lesson study, their leadership is a newer component of lesson study, and so it's not fully developed. As I've gone through, I've been talking about our model as emerging, and we are still in the process of developing in partnership with the regional academies. And so equity is always the focus of professional learning lesson study, as well as localization. So each area of focus that that the regional academies have developed is very specific to the context in which professional learning takes place. And so areas of focus are identified through available data, observation, collaboration, and consultation about an area of equity in the context of professional learning that the regional academy would like to explore. And so here you can see the two different processes. So from teacher lesson study to professional learning lesson study. So in the traditional lesson study approach, the curriculum is studied, goals are formulated, a lesson is designed that teachers or educators believe will help them achieve that goal. And then the lesson is implemented and observed, and there's a reflection on what has happened. As you can see in the other cycle, with the focus on equity in our lesson study cycle, we define the goal, develop a plan, which includes development of a tool or approach, implement and observe, which the observation components and the revisions include a lot of collaboration, consultation. We use consultancy protocols a lot, where the regional academies are working with each other to engage in this process of analyzing data and looking at what is happening with what they've implemented so that they can revise and re-implement it and then reflect on what has happened specific to professional learning. And so on this slide, you can see the differences between the traditional lesson study and professional learning lesson study. So traditionally, lesson study is led by teachers. Throughout the lesson study, professional learning lesson study, it's led by regional academy leaders, so professional learning leaders. Typically in traditional lesson study, the lessons are created for students and focused on teaching. However, in professional learning lesson study, it's created for educational leaders and focused on professional learning. All right, so here you'll see, this is the book by Brandy Hinault Crawford, which guides our work around continuous improvement. And so lesson study, like I've mentioned, professional learning lesson study is a continuous improvement approach that we implement for expanding the capacity of regional leaders to improve professional leadership learning opportunities through equity-centered self-study. And so throughout the process, we use these questions that you see here as guidance. What are we trying to accomplish? Who benefits and why is it important? And so looking back at the equity statement that Viet shared at the beginning of the presentation, all of these questions are really geared towards ensuring that that the lesson study and the continuous improvement efforts embody the equity statement of an equity focus that improves outcomes for all students and leaders who work in education systems. And so how will we know if the change is an improvement? Who defines what it means to improve? Whose values are being represented? What change might be introduced and why? whose values and ideas are incorporated, who bears the burden of implementing the change. So these are all questions that guide our process. They guide our consultancies that we engage in. We also, in addition to our community of practice, we have regular one-on-one meetings with each regional academy, and we ask a lot of questions around their area of focus, what kinds of data they're coming up with, what they're learning, what changes they're making, and our questions are really these core questions really guide the ways in which we consider how lesson study is being implemented across those one-on-one meetings, as well as the community of practice that we facilitate. And so here you'll see the professional learning lesson study cycle. And so there's equity focus throughout the phases of the inquiry. So we're continuously asking, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? How do we know if the change is an improvement, and what change might we introduce and why? And so I've talked a little bit about this cycle already and what it looks like in practice, defining the focus, which is equity-centered planning. So discussing, defining, planning, and creating. And then implementation, observation, and debrief, which again, the implementation, observation, and debrief components include a lot of collaboration between the regional academies, as well as between the state center facilitators, the 4 of us, and the regional academies as well. And then there's revision and re-implementation, more observations, and then of course, more reflections and considerations around what is next to continuously improve equity-focused professional learning offerings for leaders. And so as sort of a summary, the professional learning lesson study process is a collaborative process and includes a lot of collaborative practices. And so we start by defining the research goal, so identifying and focusing the study on the specific equity issue, development of that research plan, to address that goal, implementation and observation, so putting the plan into action, and then finally revising and re-implementing with data, and revising the plan based on findings and testing the revised plan. Something that I want to note about data, and Viet alluded to this a little bit in the beginning, is that we also, with the equity focus, not only in the goal of professional learning lesson study, but in our work together, we really also think about what we consider to be data. Whose voices are present? Whose voices are missing? What kinds of observations are conducted? How are we collecting data in ways that are accessible and equitable? So that's something that we prioritize when we think about what we consider data, in addition to traditional data sources and data collection tools that are developed. And finally, reflection. So reflecting on the entire process, sharing findings, and then thinking about how to sustain the effective new practices. And throughout each of these steps, what's important to note is that all of the steps include a lot of consultation and collaboration. So around defining goals and moving through this process, we've really facilitated the collective or community of practice in a way that regional academy leaders are able to give each other feedback, consult, and collaborate throughout this process. And so that's what you see below. I talked a little bit about the data, a lot of consultation that includes facilitators and other regional academies, and then there's a lot of collegial collaboration. So working with colleagues in a supportive learning community, and everybody is working on an equity-focused goal. And it's really productive to have folks from really different contexts talking to each other about what they're doing and what they're seeing in in their efforts to provide equity-focused professional learning for educational leaders. And so as of October of this year, you can see what the different areas of focus are for the 7 regional academies. I'll give you a moment to look through. These are the equity-focused questions that the different regional academies are focusing on. All right. And so, Via, if you can take us back to slide 9. So now that you've learned a little bit about lesson study and we've shared some of our process, what we would like you to do with those focal questions in mind is go ahead and add to the Padlet if you haven't gotten a chance to already. Any takeaways that are coming up, any questions that have emerged, anything that might be unclear. So we'll take a few minutes and then we'll go ahead and have a discussion. And I'll put those focus questions in the chat, and they're also on the Padlet. So we'll give it a few minutes for folks to add their thoughts, comments, takeaways, questions, and please feel free to respond to each other's comments. Feel free to post your questions. We'll give it till about 11:35. All right, if you haven't had a chance to add to the Padlet, please do. Like I said before, we really welcome your questions and feedback or comments around what maybe is still not clear, what questions came up as we talk through the process. All right. If you haven't had a chance to do so already, please look through what's on the Padlet. Feel free to comment or put any responses. I know we had some questions about 21 CSLA specifically. We'll give it a few minutes before we go into our discussion. All right, it doesn't look like the Padlet is too active anymore. We'll give it a little bit. Feel free if you're finishing a thought or if something comes up to go ahead and plug it in. With that said, I'll go ahead and move us into our discussion. So I'll open it up to everybody, anybody who would like to start us off, to start a discussion about any of the content that we've presented today. And the three of us will be participating in the discussion as well. Feel free to unmute.
I know I wrote this on my Wonderment on the Padlet, but could you describe what it looks like to implement and then re-implement the professional learning? And is that with the same group, different group? Are these people in these groups presenting together? I mean, I have a very strong instructional lesson study background, so I'm trying to understand what that specifically looks like in this context.
Yeah, Nancy, I see you unmuted. Did you want to answer that one?
Well, we have several regional academy participants, leaders here in our session. I wonder if any of you would like to respond to that question. Not to put you on the spot, but
I can share a little bit
Thank you.
if
Thank
I
you,
understand the question. So we are in several years of this, we're calling them cycles. I think you mentioned a re-implementation. So we did 3 cycles of, for me, it was UTK. I'm looking at UTK and the impact of equity, how equity kind of unfolds as they are implementing the professional development model. So the way that works is we had a research question, we collected data around it over several weeks, we analyzed, we had our findings, and then we prepared to maybe make some adjustments to that research question if needed. If not, we just went into a second cycle with a different, same topic, same research, perhaps a different group of trainers that I was using. There's different teams that I utilize. And so just to see if there were any other new data that would pop up. And we did about 3, we called them 3 cycles. So really using the same protocol, but we did it in 3 different cycles where we were looking at the research question, collecting data, analyzing data, writing up our findings, and then tweaking it, seeing what we learned, and then doing it again. That's what we mean by re-implementing. That's how I was able to engage in the work. I don't know if that helped, but that's.
So you were working, Amy, I'm wrapping my head around it. You would bring in leaders who were doing professional learning in their LEAs, in their districts and schools, and you would work with them.
We would actually, my research question was around the equity question of how my team how my group of trainers that I send out for UTK. So we went to them, we went to our different trainings, and then I collected data around my coaches. So my question was around how does equity play out in the implementation? I mean, that's not the exact question. So I was always looking at, so not impact necessarily yet of what UTK, how it was playing out in those classrooms, because I wasn't collecting data from participants. I'm collecting data around the coaches. So staying really close to, so it could look different depending on the question, right? On how your tool is being used and who you're observing. So for me, the cycles were helpful because I am looking at the same group of people in different scenarios over time, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome.
I think I'm wrapping my head around what it looks like in
I
a
know, and
professional learning context. So, and it's exciting. So great.
yeah, it is a little bit different than the traditional model because I too have been a part of that as well. And it took me about a year to be able to really kind of figure out, okay, where does my research fit? How could it be, how could it help expand what this definition or what this methodology could possibly look like? And that's what we're figuring out together, I think, as regions.
Yeah. Right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Amy. I think for a little more clarification, in this context, so in the lesson study context, so Amy would be the professional learning leader. So because she's working with her team to improve the practices around UTK. Yeah, the training practices. Other reflections or comments? All right. Well, if there are no other comments, I'll go ahead and transition us into the final part of our protocol, where Viet, Nancy, and I will reflect out on what we have seen and heard. So Viet or Nancy, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, would you like to go?
Thank you all so much for participating in this. I think the Padlet, reveals to us like our audience here, right? Like folks who are transferring their knowledge from lesson study, from teacher-based or focused point of view. We have folks here who want to learn more about 21 CSLA and and the work that we do and about this project. So I'm really excited to make those connections and really excited to present our work to you all today.
I think many of you brought up issues that all of us, the the regional academy leaders and our team, our center team, about, well, what do we mean by equity? What does equity look like in this process? We go over, we talk about it. We've talked about it for 3 years and how it's centered in this initiative. And then the other piece that I'm hearing from all of you is to make sure, and Amy addressed this, like what, there are real differences between teacher lesson study and professional learning lesson study, and to make sure that we explicate that very well. So thank you for your feedback. We appreciate it so much.
Yeah, I think, I agree with what's been said, and this question around how is equity defined in the process? How does the participant ensure the process is equity focused? Like Nancy said, it is something that we worked on articulating for a long time. And Amy talked about, it took a year to really solidify what this process sort of looks like in collaboration. And like I talked about before, we're still in the process of finalizing the model. And so if you look at the slide deck, you can see the different areas of equity that are reflected in the questions that the regional academies, or the areas of focus. You can see, and then as always, through our community of practice and facilitation and conversations, we really discuss these questions that are on this post around how each regional academy is defining equity. How are we sure? One of the things I think that Amy brought up after her as a reflection is that equity is not only in the content, it's also in the process of planning and engaging in professional learning. So yeah. Any other, Viet or Nancy, final reflections before we close? All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We do have a new brief that we just completed on professional learning lesson studies, so feel free to check that out. I can drop the link in the chat. Thank you so much for engaging with us today and for providing your feedback. We really appreciate it. And we'll transition to the next slide, which will